Old Anon here. This happened to me in the 80s when I was about 9 or 10 years old. Go camping road trip with grandparents. Grandpa liked to go fishing and frogging. We go frogging in the irrigation canals in Capay, Knights Landing and Dunnigan on the Sacramento River Delta. Nights are so dark you can only see in beam of old-timey 30-lumen flashlights. We caught frog in a small trolling boat while Grandma stood at the camp and caught huge catfish. Probably get to bed in back camper of truck around 1:30 to 2 a.m. Very tired and fall asleep fast. Awake a short time later around 3 a.m. Can hear car approaching from far away in the silence. Car comes nearby on levee. Hold my breath to hear better. Hear car door open and door buzz. Hear other car door open. Hear bushes rustling then large splash. Hear 2 car doors slam and car drive off. Figured splash was crawfish trap which people used to set and leave. Drifted back to sleep. Around 7 o'clock in the morning. Sheriff over loudspeaker, you in the camper, come out with your hands up. Grandpa opens camper door and gets out. Then Grandma, then me. Cops ask a bunch of questions. What time we arrived, what we saw, what we heard. It turns out those 2 guys in the car had dumped a badly mutilated corpse in the irrigation ditch on the opposite side of the levee. A game warden had spotted it and called for backup. Never got to see body. Sleep with a weapon whenever I'm camping or on a road trip ever since.
Be me, teenager about 17. Live in North Van at the time. Walking with then girlfriend, call her C, to another friend's house, call her G, for her birthday get together. It's late, about 8 to 8:30, early February. Friend lives in the Kirkstone area. If there are any 604 in here, you'd probably know that Kirkstone is fairly wooded around the homes. On way to G's place there is a shortcut where you can walk through a wooded power line trail and come into the back of the complex she lives in rather than taking the road and walking the long way around. Was an avid hiker and bit of a spurg survivalist as a teen, so I had bear spray, flashlight, and a knife on me. C and I come to the start of the shortcut part. Pop out flashlight and continue down trail. Getting close to G's place, can see the lights ahead. Hear some twigs snap about 5 meters away. Turn light to see what did it. See a dude just standing there staring at me, completely motionless. Looks a little bit ratty. Has that really far gone look in his eyes like a repeat meth user. Startled, take a step back. C moves behind me. He doesn't move an inch. Uncap bear spray in my pocket and take it out and hold it at my waist, eyes locked with the dude. He remains motionless. Keeping C behind me, slowly back toward G's complex. Dude doesn't move an inch, eyes locked with mine. He watches us back away all the way to the complex. Kept the flashlight trained on him the entire time, he doesn't even blink. Once clear of the woods, and nearing a corner in the complex, C and I turn and full sprint to G's place. Mention it to friends, everyone is perturbed, but then forget about it because they're teenagers. Rest of the night proceeds without incident. Day or 2 later, back home. Reading newspaper because spurg. See article about a corpse found in bags in the same wooded area. Poop maxing pants, realizing the creeper I walked past was more than likely the body's killer.
This event that I am about to relate to you is the truth, so help me God. It happened in the early spring of 1951 in Korea. We were in the Army Infantry, 25th Division, 27th Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Easy Company. We were in what is known on the military maps as the Iron Triangle, near Korwan. It is night. We are located on the slopes of a mountain, below which there is a Korean village. Previously we have sent our men into this village to warn the populace that we are going to bombard it with artillery. On this night, we were doing just that. We had aerial artillery bursts coming in. We suddenly noticed on our right-hand side what appeared to be a jack-o'-lantern come wafting down across the mountain. And at first no one thought anything about it. So we noticed that this thing continued on down to the village to where, indeed, the artillery air bursts were exploding. It had an orange glow in the beginning. We further noticed that this object was so quick that it could get into the center of an airburst of artillery and yet remain unharmed. The time element on this, I would say, was anywhere from, 45 minutes to an hour all told. But then this object approached us. And it turned a blue-green brilliant light. It's hard to distinguish the size of it, there's no way to compare it. The light was pulsating. This object approached us. I asked for and received permission from Lt. Evans, our company commander at that time, to fire upon this object, which I did with an M1 rifle with armor-piercing bullets. And I did hit it. It must have been metallic because you could hear when the projectile slammed into it. Now why would that bullet damage this craft if the artillery rounds didn't? I don't know, unless they had dropped their protective field around them, or whatever. But the object went wild, and the light was going on and off. It went off completely once, briefly. And it was moving erratically from side to side as though it might crash to the ground. Then, a sound dash. We had heard no sound previous to this, the sound of, like, diesel locomotives rewing up. That's the way this thing sounded. And then, we were attacked. We were swept by some form of array that was emitted in pulses, in waves that you could visually see only when it was aiming directly at you. That is to say, like a searchlight sweeps around and, you would see it coming at you. Now you would feel a burning, tingling sensation all over your body, as though something were penetrating you. So the company commander, Lt. Evans, hauled us into our bunkers. We didn't know what was going to happen. We were scared. These are underground dugouts where you have peepholes to look out to fire at the enemy. So, I'm in my bunker with another man. We're peeping out at this thing. It hovered over us for a while, lit up the whole area with its light, and then I saw it shoot off at a 45-degree angle, that quick, just there and gone. That quick. And it was as though that was the end of it. But, 3 days later the entire company of men had to be evacuated by ambulance. They had to cut roads in there and haul them out. They were too weak to walk. They had dysentery. Then subsequently, when the doctors did see them, they had an extremely high white blood cell count which the doctors could not account for. Now in the military, especially the army, each day you file a company report. We had a confab about that. Do we file it in the report or not? And the consensus was no, because they'd lock every one of us up and think we were crazy. At that time, no such thing as a UFO had ever been heard of, and we didn't know what it was. I still don't know what it was. But I do know that since that time I have periods of disorientation, memory loss, and I dropped from 180 pounds to 138 pounds after I got back to this country. And I've had great difficulty keeping my weight up. Indeed, I'm retired and disabled today. Oh, man. This story is really freaking weird. The guy who shared this story returned a few times to share updates. These updates will be dated when I post them. I'm an early riser. I get up around 4 a.m. most days, and I like to sit outside before the sun rises to have a smoke. On this particular morning, I was outside with a cup of tea just before dawn. I was thumbing a bowl of tobacco in my pipe when I heard a shuffling toward the pine trees at the edge of my property. The back of my house faces the edge of a thick line of short pine trees, and I see critters run in and out of it all the time, so I assumed the noise was an armadillo or something. But when I looked up I saw what looked like an obese woman with sagging breasts, except her head was kind of like an odd lump on her shoulders, very small and without hair or any normal features. I immediately set my things down on the patio table and called out to her. There was just enough light from the floodlights on my house to see her large bare bottom as she turned and ran away. I could very easily hear the thumping sounds of feet in the pines. I called the police right then and there, and told them what I'd seen. 3 county deputies responded within 20 minutes, and they scoured my entire property, and searched around the edge of the pine trees. For over an hour, I recalled what I'd seen, giving them every detail I could remember. None of us could come up with any explanation. The lot of pine trees is 20+ acres, and connects to a stretch of grassland where the only humans would be whoever is on the interstate. I urged them to search the pines, convinced there was a naked woman running around in there. Methamphetamine and other harsh drugs are not unknown where I live, and in my years living in this region have seen my share of crazed addicts. The deputies told me they couldn't search just then, and that they would need help. They filed a report, and told me to go inside and lock my doors. I did so. I also retrieved my pistol from the bedroom and stuck it in my waistband. Around 1 p.m. a new lot of deputies came knocking, and I walked them over to exactly where I'd seen this person. 2 of them hung back with me while the others went into the pines looking around. They spent about a half hour in there before they came back with no evidence or explanation. They were all very helpful but didn't sound very concerned and eventually left after scanning around my backyard a bit too. Every morning since then when I went out to have my morning smoke my eyes were fixed on the pines, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary until I was up late one night. I'd been entertaining guests earlier and had made us a pot of strong coffee, so I couldn't sleep. They left around midnight and an hour later, after cleaning up, I stepped out back with a glass of wine and my pipe. I turned the back lights on and immediately saw the fat woman again. This time I could see her much better. When the dim light hit her body she moved like a dog would if it had suffered an injury. I could see her face better this time, and it definitely looked like she was missing her nose. She loped into the pines again, but this time I ran towards her as fast as my legs could carry me. I have very little cartilage left in my knees, so it wasn't very fast. I heard her shuffling away into the pines just as I reached the tree line, then I called the police. They said they were on their way, so I went back inside, turned on all the outside lights, and grabbed a flashlight and my pistol. This time they went deep in the pines. I could see their flashlights flickering around and they finally came back and said they couldn't find anything. They advised me again to lock my doors and keep my gun close at hand. By the time the police left it was almost 3 a.m., and when I went inside my cat Augustus was growling at the back window. I decided to try to nap in my big chair hoping my cat would join me, but we were both too nervous. Just before dawn I'd almost fallen asleep when Augustus began growling loudly again and slapping at the small window. I turned on the lamp and got a full glimpse of the half face of the large woman. I knew it was her immediately. Her face had holes where a nose should be and swollen lips. Her eyes were dark brown all over and not like normal eyes. I got up and yelled, pointing my pistol at her, and she turned and ran. I saw her scramble away through the window, then went to the patio door and turned the lights on so I could see better. Her breasts were swinging and the mass of her body as she ran toward the pines. I opened the door and fired 2 shots toward the top of the pines. I had no desire to harm her, but I wanted to put the fear in her that I was armed and done playing around. I'm not a young man and I live alone, but with a faithful cat and several guns. I again called the police, only this time I went to their office to speak to a detective. She was more than helpful and said they would patrol the area regularly and that if someone was running around out there they would catch her. This was in January, and I didn't have any more problems except for my guard cat and I not being able to sleep very well at night. I haven't seen her since then, but I know in my heart now she isn't really a woman but something else. It's been 3 weeks since I've last heard from the police about it, but I lately have the feeling that she is still out there. Augustus and me are ready if she comes back, though he is much braver than I am. I'm thinking about moving away. Tonight one of my neighbors came to my house, the closest of the 2 from me. I don't want to say any names because he is a genuine guy and I like him a lot, but I have known him for a few years now, and I trust him. I am going to talk to him more later today. My neighbor went on asking me if I had heard screaming and loud thud sounds coming from the pine sprawl. I said I hadn't and told him I had been listening to music on my laptop most of the evening, so I wouldn't have heard anything anyway, but I did mention that my cat had been darting around and that might have been him hearing those sounds. Both of my neighbors know about what happened to me as I went directly to their doors to tell them about it. I wanted them to be aware, and now my neighbor is hearing what he described as definitely human screams and thuds that sounded like trees falling but without the snapping sounds of branches. I told him to load a gun, and keep an ear out for anything else. Me and Augustus have gotten comfortable now in the living room and we don't take chances anymore. I am going to talk to my neighbor more, including my farthest neighbor later today. Here is what happened today. I was up very late listening to music. Another tool I use for settling my nerves. I don't sleep in my bedroom anymore and have started sleeping on my couch or in my big chair. So when Wayne knocked on my door around 1 a.m. asking if I had heard the screaming or the big thud sounds, I told him I hadn't because I had been listening to music and had not looked at my phone when he said he tried to call me a bunch but saw my lights on, so he came over. I told him to load a gun and sleep lightly. I did the same because it was strange to see Wayne so late. Wayne owns a building materials business, so he's an early riser like me. I slept for 6 hours and got up to make some breakfast and feed Augustus. Wayne called me not long after saying that the police had been to our far neighbor's house and that they were all in the field and in the pines. Wayne had not slept and had breakfast made, so he invited me to eat. I crossed the giant grass lot that separates our property and I could see police in the field walking around. Over breakfast, Wayne called our neighbor again and asked if we could stop by, and he said he wanted to talk to us. Our farthest neighbor is a younger man in his 30s and he's a good no-nonsense fellow made of hard stuff, but he looked really tired and shaken when Wayne and I got there. He and his girlfriend were dozing off when they were startled by shrill screaming and thrashing at their back door. He said it was like a giant fish flopping on the door and horrible screaming. Their door was something awful. There was major damage to it and deep gashes and mud. They said the thrashing at the back stopped and it was quiet for a minute. As he was getting dressed to go investigate, something slammed itself against the bedroom window and screamed against the glass. His poor girlfriend described it as a throat scream that could have come from a man or a woman. They were both very shaken but were putting on brave faces. He said he grabbed his shotgun and ran outside immediately. He said he heard the screaming getting farther away along the edge of the pines toward Wayne's property. He didn't see anything. The deputies were still walking around outside, and a few of them I recognized. Sure enough, that detective I spoke to kept her word and they had been patrolling the area closely all this time, so they arrived fairly quickly, my neighbor said. The loud thuds that Wayne heard could not be explained, but we have made plans to hike deep through the pines and explore. We all and the deputies had a long talk on my far neighbor's property. In the end, they believed it to be animals or possible malicious mischief. I think from the tone of one of them they suspected Wayne or myself of playing a prank on them in the night, but they didn't directly accuse us. They left us with the advice that if we find someone sneaking around our property at night acting aggressive and strange, to do what we feel is necessary for our safety. We have agreed to keep in close contact with each other from now on and to immediately send texts whenever something happens so we can all assist. I take naps in the day now to stay up a bit later at night.
Marc ran and ran, as fast as he could. The cold rain and wind made it difficult. The more wet he became, the heavier his clothing was. He dropped his rifle and hunting equipment in a hope that he would be able to move quicker. It seemed to work. Then a howl pierced the sky and echoed through the pine forest. He hesitated. The woods this far north are known for their unforgiving nature. Not only was the landscape dangerous, but the beasts were large and merciless. But it was getting darker. He had to continue. The cabin wasn't very far, maybe another half hour of running and he'll be safe, Marc thought. Another bellowing howl came from behind. His bones ached at the sound. Marc reached the river. If he swam through it, they would lose his scent. He would have to be quick, he thought. It was near autumn and the waters were very cold. He went it. The icy waters chilled his limbs as Marc forced himself to the other side. The possibility of hypothermia was very real to him, but he figured if he kept running his body heat would return quickly. He continued. The cold sapped his strength and Marc tripped over numerous roots and stones, but he was close now. He could see the trail through the trees. The howl seemed to stop. That's when he felt the sharp bite at his leg. Marc reeled in pain. But this was no wolf, it was a trap set by he himself. A bear trap he placed weeks before. Its partially rusted teeth dug into his ankle, any movement sent shooting pain up his leg. Then he heard them again. The wolves weren't behind him but all around him, some distance away, hidden in the trees and bushes. They were watching him, and he knew it. Marc tried to focus. He attempted to bend the teeth of the trap open but they didn't budge. His strength left him with the rain and the river. His hand slipped over the steel trap and only caused him more pain. Panicked, he turned at the sound of leaves rustling yards away. The trap man was enough to attract the wolves into an area they don't usually tread. they could smell the blood, he thought, he had to act quickly. He looked around for anything that could pry the trap open. Marc abandoned his gear half a mile back, but he still had his hunting knife on his belt. Carefully he unsheathed the knife and tried to pry the trap. The blade shook with his hands as he pushed. But it didn't work. The only thing it accomplished was agitating his punctured flesh and causing more blood to run down into his boot. Another sound of movement came at his right. Marc turned, blade in hand, ready for the attacker. But there was nothing. The wolves were smart, they wouldn't reveal themselves until the moment was right. Marc wiped his wet hair from his eyes and tried to get a better look, but there was still nothing to be seen. His body shook all over. What was he to do? No one could come to help him, he lived alone, away from most of the civilization. He had nothing but his knife, but he had to survive. Marc looked at the thick blade for a moment that seemed like hours. He knew what he had to do. Marc clenched his jaw, baring his teeth as he moved the blade into position. His breathing became very heavy and then stopped entirely. Quickly and with all the strength he had left, he forced the knife into his ankle. Marc shrieked in pain and blood poured from his leg. An echoing howl from the trees responded right after. His blade had only cut through an inch of flesh, he was into the muscle, and afterward he would have to go through the bone. It was impossible, he thought. Then he heard another rustling. He snatched the blade from his leg and held it out in preparation. The bushes parted slightly, enough to reveal the eyes of his hunter. Another howl, and another came from both sides of him. Marc knew what this meant. Suddenly, 4 massive wolves leapt from their hiding spots and attached themselves to Marc by his limbs. They roared as their teeth sunk into his flesh. The pain was unimaginable as they twisted and teared at his arms and legs. With quick work, his arm was completely off. Before Marc had a chance to scream, another wolf took him by the throat. One by one, each of his limbs were torn from his body. Slowly his lungs began to fill with blood, and his mind grew slower as he neared death. It was a month before anyone went looking for him. A single blood-stained knife, bone fragments, and the bear trap was enough to tell them of Marc's fate.
So I got the chance to visit my old high school buddy, Danny, shortly after I graduated college. I was going to stay a few days with him and his new wife, Carolyn. So I packed a few days worth of clothes and drive to Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. I get there and it's hot as a mother lover and just as humid. We say our hellos, introduces me to Carolyn, and we head inside to eat dinner. Carolyn seems nice. Somewhat reserved but curious about me and my friendship with Danny as kids. She lets me and Danny do most of the talking, but asks some good questions to steer along the conversation. Lots of smiles, she was. After dinner, she and Danny cleaned up and I got to spend some time getting acquainted with their dog, Truman. He's small, shook all the time, and never shut the hell up. One of those yippy dogs that thinks it's bigger than everything else around it. He didn't bite though, so I didn't really mind. Once the table was clear, Carolyn leashed up Truman and took him out for a walk. Danny and I moved to the living room and caught up over the last few years. He had popped open a beer and was really enjoying the AC, as was I. We somewhat lost track of time and Danny had noticed that it had grown dark out and that Carolyn was usually back by now. He didn't seem too concerned, as sometimes she took Truman out the long way around the neighborhood. It's a small one and close the edge of the state park where there are a lot of hiking paths that lead off. Some circle around and back to the street, so it's a good way to get a nice walk in. We keep talking and I realized that nearly an hour has passed since she left. Danny has kept looking, eyeing the time on his phone, and he finally picks it up to text her. Even on the long walks, she's not usually out this long. Just as he hit send, the front door opens. Truman shoots through the door. He didn't make a damn sound as he sulked straight under the couch and didn't come out. I can't see out the door from where I'm sitting, but I caught a slight whiff of something foul. I can't really describe it, but it was strong enough to leave the taste of copper in my mouth. The smell went away just as quick as it had come, and slowly Carolyn steps into the house. She was slow and shuffling. There was a slight hunch to her, like she was worn out, and damn did she look it. Her knees had a slight gait to them as she walked in, leaving the door open behind her. After a few paces, she stopped, still holding the leash and not turning to face either of us. Danny shot up and, after closing the door, went up to Carolyn, asking if everything was fine. He slowly turned her to face him, as she looked real woozy, like she was about to fall over. Her mouth worked open and shut a few times, like she was trying to find the right thing to say, but nothing was coming out. Finally, she was able to wheeze out fine, though it sounded anything but. Danny felt her forehead, then mumbled something about getting her some water and aspirin and left for the kitchen. It took me a moment for the creeping feelings to settle on me. It wasn't the smell or the awkward shuffling that did it. When I think back on it, I believe it was when I finally noticed that ever since she stepped through that damn door, she didn't once blink. Being all gentlemanly, I asked Carolyn if she wanted to sit down and offered to take the leash. I was a bit nervous, but not enough to still feel helpful. As I reached down to, gently, take the leash from her, I realized something else. It could have been the half a beer I had, or the fact that I had just finished driving 8 hours to get here that day, but I could swear that her right arm was slightly longer than her left. By slightly, I mean by at least a few inches. It could have been the way she was slightly hunched over, or maybe her left arm was bent in such a way that I didn't notice, but the entire proportion just seemed off. Still not taking the tingling hint to get the hell out of there, I asked her if she did anything to hurt her arm. She slowly turned her head to regard me. Arm, she repeated, then twisted her head down to regard it, like just now noticing it was there. I shit you not when I say that her arm spasmed as she eyed it. Then, after a few cracks and pops, it seemed to shrink down to the right size. She then turned back to me for a moment, then shuffled past me into the hallway bathroom, the door closing behind her. It was at this point that I noped right the hell into the kitchen, where Danny was just coming out. I grabbed him by the arm and pulled him back into the kitchen. I told him that I think something was very wrong with Carolyn, and explained what I just saw. He stood quiet for a few moments listening to me, his eyes looking behind me into the living room. He finally said, "I'll go check on her. She should be fine though." He looked like he was trying to convince himself more than me. He went and knocked on the bathroom door before entering. The door was closed behind him and, for a few minutes, I could only hear his muffled voice. I was still creeped out, but stood my ground, waiting to see if I needed to shift into full fight or flight mode. Not long after, the door opened and Danny stepped out with Carolyn not far behind him. He smiled at me and said, "It looks like she just got overwhelmed by the heat. I'm going to go ahead and take her up to bed. I'll be back down in a minute." I then looked to Carolyn, who was holding the water bottle that Danny had brought her. It was half gone, so it seemed to click with me then that she could have been dehydrated. But, Jesus, that arm. I can't just unsee that crap. He helped her upstairs, and as they were climbing, I thought I could hear Carolyn rasp out, "Be back." I wanted to nope right back into my car and drive off, but that would instantly turn me into Mr. Freaking Friend, and social pressure finally won over instinctual fear. Frustrated, I sat down on the recliner and eyed Truman, still huddled under the couch. He hadn't made a single noise since getting home, and he looked scared crapless. I gently patted my knee to call him out, and he refused to budge. Well, screw him. I tried. It was dark and quiet, and I didn't realize that I had calmed down enough to doze off. It took a really freaking weird sound from upstairs to wake me. It was quiet and muffled, but low enough to rumble the seat slightly. It was a repeated sound, and the only thing I can compare it to was a giant cat hawking a hairball. I'm not sure why I was stupid enough to do this, probably that sense of duty among friends, but I got my ass out of that chair and slowly made my way upstairs. The guttural hawking noise didn't stop, and it was definitely coming from Danny and Carolyn's room. That foul stench was back, and pretty damned potent. The combo of the smell and the noise was almost enough to empty my own guts. I reached the door, which was, of course, closed, and I was getting closer and closer to flipping the hell out as I neared it. Why am I doing this? What the hell are you doing, Anon? Get the hell out, I thought to myself. But no, I didn't. Not for a few more minutes, Anyway, I knocked on the door, hoping they were just doing some kind of kinky messing around I didn't want to picture. The retching sound continued. I stood there looking like an awkward dumbass for a minute before knocking again, this time asking, "Is everything alright in there?" More hawking and retching. The dim noise wasn't letting up. I steeled myself, in case my friend was in some real trouble. I wanted to know what to describe to the cops when I decided to finally call them. I reached for the doorknob and twisted it open. What I saw was all in the span of a few seconds, before I registered enough to decide to nope straight the hell out of the house and dive away. It looked like Carolyn. Almost. The top half of her was really wide, and her naked, sagging breasts inflated and deflated like respiratory masks. Not sure why my eyes caught sight of her breasts first, probably because I'm a guy? Hell if I know. What should have caught my attention first were the two monstrosities poking out of her shoulder blades. Like an extra set of arms or some crap, only somewhat bony and jointed, like the limbs of a flesh-colored insect. They arched over her and back down onto the bed in front of her. I then noticed her mouth. It was open wide, far wider than what it should have been. Something was emerging from it, like a dark and wet sack of something, and her entire body was convulsing as the thing slid further out of her mouth. It was hanging over what I finally noticed was Danny. Her body was so wide that I at first didn't see him underneath her. Danny was quite dead. Or unconscious with a crap ton of blood loss. Red was everywhere. The bed, the walls, the floor. It was especially all over Carolyn, though I doubt much, if any, was hers. Without stopping whatever the hell ritual she was doing over her husband, she looked up. This was when I noped down the stairs, grabbed the keys off the counter, said screw it to the bag of clothes I left upstairs, and drove the hell away. I'd like to say that I called the police right then. I didn't. My God, I didn't. I drove for 4 hours, constantly checking my rear view until I couldn't see straight, and then stopped at the next motel. Bolted the doors and slept with all the lights on. In the morning I called the authorities and placed an anonymous tip to have them check Danny's address. It was after a week since returning home that I had Googled their names. A small article appeared on the local news site that stated that he and Carolyn were missing from their residence. No sign of forced entry or any blood or struggle. The only puzzle was that their cars were both left parked in the garage. I can still hear that retching. Feel the vibration of it in my chest. It makes me glad that I never gave Danny my new address.
I saw an Anza Borrego ghost light a few months ago. It's not the spookiest of stories, but it's true. Hiking with friends to the Goat Canyon Trestle. The hike itself follows 100-year-old railroad tracks down a gorge, leading from the mountains at the top to the desert floor below over about 20 miles. Lots of abandoned train cars, cool tunnels, and sketchy railroad trestles to cross. The hike is technically trespassing because some company claims that it's going to get the railroad running again. Nobody gives a damn because several companies have tried and all have failed thanks to inhospitable geology and weather. It's usually a pretty popular hike, but we went on a weekday so we were the only ones out there. First few miles are spent enjoying the scenery and getting enough courage to cross janky old trestles. Screw around in some old double-decker train cars covered in surprisingly good graffiti. GTFO the train cars because the dust in there is pure nose murder. Continue on, see no other people. Go through a few railroad tunnels. They're supported by huge redwood beams which make the tunnels smell comfy as hell. Have a pleasant walk through them by the light of a single good flashlight and 2 crappy ones. Get to the longest tunnel on the line, research says about 1/2 mile or so. It has big rusty gates at the entrance and a bunch of old railroad junk around, very horror movie looking in the right light. It was noon, so spook factor was low. Tunnel curves so you can't see the other end for the first bit. Walking along when we see a light appear down towards the other end of the tunnel, much like someone turning a flashlight on for a second, then off again. Figure it's another group of hikers, flash the bright light at them. No response, think whatever and keep walking. Light flashes again. We're getting closer to the end of the tunnel. There's light shining in at the end, but the flash came from a dark area. Don't see any people silhouetted against the light at the end of the tunnel. May have just been nerves, but we felt like we were being watched. Start hallucinating voices almost at the edge of hearing, also likely nerves. Light flashes randomly one more time then stops. Pretty spooked, but we're relatively skeptical folks and continued all the way to the end of the tunnel. Not a soul in sight. The trail is bordered by a very steep cliff to the right and Carrizo Gorge to the left. Trail is visible for a long way ahead. It's extremely unlikely that there were other hikers that ran off. Try to explain the light as reflection and cannot find anything reflective anywhere. Remember stories of the Borrego ghost lights. A train conductor in 1977 saw a similar light flash on the tracks at night and ended up derailing a train. People have followed the lights into caves where they have seriously injured themselves. Get moderately spooked and continue on. No more lights, just a feeling of unease. Forget all that shit when we cross the 200 feet tall Goat Canyon trestle and about crap ourselves. See nobody else on the trip aside from a group of Boy Scouts starting to hike into camp on our way out. Guess we believe in ghosts now. If you're ever in San Diego County and want a sweet and pretty easy hike with confirmed spook factor, check out the Goat Canyon trestle. Aside from having cool scenery and weird lights, you get to see a lot of cool engineering, neat abandoned train cars, loads of history, and the tallest curved wooden railroad trestle in the world. Some sources claim is the tallest surviving wooden railroad trestle overall. Pick related is the big trestle itself.
Time for some OC. This one is called the Valley of the Bargaining Spirit. There are some areas in the world where the native people do not care to tread. Perhaps it leads to hell. Or perhaps it is cursed by the foulest magics. Or perhaps the land conscientiously wishes to destroy the wanderers with the forces of nature. Whatever the case, the native people know by instinct that a human presence is not wanted there. Unless, of course, a deal is made with the right authorities. The Cherokee people have such a place. In North Georgia, right at the tip of the border between North Carolina and South Carolina, there is a valley, about 30 meters in length and covered in bushes and trees. In Cherokee folklore, a myth to be specific, the valley was referred to as the Valley of the Bargaining Spirit. At the valley's center was a spirit who always stood there, always staring at whoever stared into the valley. The spirit didn't move at all, until someone tried to speak to it. If spoken to, the spirit would ask if the traveler wanted land to farm on in his valley. The spirit promised fertile land and frequent sunlight and rain in exchange for either their youngest child or their freedom as a human being. Of course, no one in Cherokee times would be willing to give up their children or their lives to farm, but there were those who wanted to defy its rules anyway. The myth says that those who dared to settle in the valley without bargaining with the spirit would see their crops fail and the land turn hostile to them. After a month of torture, they would simply go missing, never to be heard from again. In 1794, right around the time squatters and settlers started arriving in Appalachia in droves, the land rights for the valley were handed out in a lottery in Macon. The winners were a Jack Vernon, a well-off and unmarried printer, the Green family, an Irish family that recently immigrated to Georgia, and Eliza Farnsworth, a single woman with 2 children who occasionally worked in brothels. There were some rumors that the lottery was rigged and that the lottery men knew of the valley's spirit, which wasn't very surprising. Vernon was considered a heartless liar and thief in his business. He drove most of the printers out of Augusta by attacking their personal character with falsified stories in his paper. In a time of sensational news, the poor never saw difference and these men were gotten rid of without a second thought. He took advantage of his only partner, Richard Lott, and stole his half of the business by claiming his was too mentally ill to take care of it. Most of Georgia's elite recognized him as a monster, and saw this lottery as a way of getting rid of a parasite before he got any stronger. Farnsworth was a single woman who refused to marry any man. She was intensely beautiful in all accounts. However, her moral standards, influenced from birth by her mother's work in brothels, told her that men were collectively the same. They were all pigs to her and would abuse her the second they realized they could. And so, she worked in brothels since age 13, giving men pleasure, but denying them any other type of control, and had 2 children, Danielle and Jeremy, from her practice. She regularly warned men not to try to date her and told them off as soon as they finished. While brothels were tolerated, such outspoken unmarried women were considered pariahs and bound to be sent away by the elites. And the Greens were, of course, Irish. In the conservative white microcosm that was old Georgia, they were a waste of human flesh, and deserved to be eliminated. In a few short months, they left settled Georgia, and traveled north. When they asked for directions from the local Cherokee, they warned them of the danger, but refused to stop them. It may have been a small amount of hatred towards the white man that told them to let them go, but we'll never really know for sure. Upon arrival in the valley, they saw the spirit. According to Mr. Green, who left a journal of his time there, the group saw a man covered with a long black coat, with long breeches, a red waistcoat, a 3-cornered hat and a drama mask bearing the face for laughter. He stood impeccably erect with his arms behind his back. His body was long and tall, and most of all imposing. A man worthy of owning land. Vernon was the first to speak with the man in the valley. It went, according to the journal. "Are you the one who owns this land?" The man said, in a raspy, high-toned voice, "Of course. I've owned it for quite a long time." "I'm sure you do. But tell me, where is your deed to this place? I need to see that before I can be so sure as to ask you for it." "I need no deed. My persons here and stories about me is all I need to prove I own it." "Then it is mine. I have the deed to farm here. Paper means nothing to me. If you farm here, I know the land will ruin me and I'll go missing. To be honest, I think you're lying. I know your game, and I know you ain't nothing but a trickster and a liar. This is now my land, as well as the land of the Greens and Miss Farnsworth. So get lost." "Very well. Do as you will. I will ask in 3 days if you wish to accept my bargain." The next to speak was Miss Farnsworth. "You're the spirit, I take it?" The spirit spoke in his raspy, high-toned voice, "Yes. And I suppose you want my land as well?" "I just want to farm here, nothing more." "Then you know my rules. If you wish to farm here, then you have to give me either your youngest child or your life as payment." The woman immediately attacked him. "No. I'm not giving you one of my babies. Never. And if you think that you can scare me with threats, you're wrong. I'm a strong, dignified woman, and I'll be damned before I let any man control my life. I only ask that you do what is necessary to survive here. Nothing else." "Well, forget it. I have a deed here, and I will use it." "Very well. Do as will. I will ask again in 3 days for payment. It would be wise if you accepted." Finally, the Greens spoke. Mr. Green handled the negotiations. "You're Mr. Spirit. I've been told about you. Then you understand what I want to bargain for? We have been thinking for some time, and yes, we are willing to accept. We will give you our youngest son as payment. What made you decide to follow my rules, unlike your compatriot travelers? One of our sons is nothing but a small price to pay for a better life here. As long as you make good on your promise of showers and good soil, we won't make a bother." "Excellent." The Green's son was given to Spirit, and he left with him. The son, Andrew, was never seen again.
Chaneques story. On my father's side of the family's ranch we had hundreds of ciruelo, plums, trees like walking distance from my gramps' aunt's house. Ciruelo trees are very climbable. One of my gramps' favorite chore was to climb up and collect the fruits in buckets so they could sell in the market. After a long day him and cousins still like to climb around the trees and play Tarzan, eat ciruelas etc., even though they are warned not to stay too late. It's not even too dark, sky is beautiful, sunset red at around 6, and the cool breeze makes them want to stay longer. Then it begins happening. It's raining ciruelas, like hundreds of ripe ones at a given second. Kid Gramps and his cousins get down from the trees and get pelted with ciruelas on the ground. From the trees they see toddler-shaped silhouettes chucking plums at them. like a few dozen toddler gnomes swinging and pelting shit at them at the red dawn sky. Kid Gramps and cousins run back home, still getting pelted by plums meters away from the trees. "Oh, that are the Chaneques," Gramps' aunt explained to him. "They are like little men who live in the woods and probably do own the whole place." Gramps and cousins from time to time got pelted at when they walk in the tall grass areas. Sometimes their homes got pelted at with ripe plums during the sunsets, when their homes are like kilometers away from the nearest ciruelo. Little Duende fell in love with my great-grandaunt once, back then when she was a 20-ish looker. Sometimes at night she felt like some tiny hands were grabbing her ass. Her father didn't like that, so she waited while she was sleeping on a hammock and waited for the Duende to come, caught the pervert in a sack and beat him against the tree. Making sure not to kill him, just to annoy him, so that his Duende family won't come seeking revenge. Pervert Duende learned his lesson and my great-grandaunt Luce was never molested again. Last one before good night. Ranch party celebrating quinceañera. Boys hate that shit, so the elder ones slip out and go walk towards store for snacks. Get back from store on the way there, two figures on the road. Coming nearer it becomes extremely clear that it's like two midgets in coat situation, like four midgets total. They get out a hearty chuckle and even go up to shake their hairy hands. At handshake distance they find out it's three midgets in each coat. Rolling on the floor laughing. Like really good duendes just like to play these tricks. Later find out that uncle's good expensive coats were stolen while drying out. Just one short one then. Uncle drives building materials with truck going from village to village. One night gets windows smashed in with flying rocks. Those little bastards, I'll show 'em right. Takes rifle and chases after giggling midgets in the dark. Shots fired. Comes back to truck and sees the wooden loads burning in a fire. Flip here, duende stories are also common in the Philippines, even had a popular movie back in the 80s. They appear in different colored clothes depending if they are kind or somewhat evil. Here's my experience. Our house had 2 floors before. First floor had the dining room and bathrooms, while the second floor had the bedrooms and TV rooms. Was in high school back then, had to wake up early for something I can't remember. Going down groggily to staircase, past the dining room onto the sink to wash my face. As I passed the dining room, 2 duendes were climbing onto the dining table from a chair, like one was standing on the chair, with clenched hands as the other duende was stepping on the other one's hands to reach the table. Still half asleep at that time, so I shrugged it off as meh. When I realized what I just saw, I took a look at the table again and no one's there, but the chair was in the exact place where the duendes were standing. Parents made sure that chairs are on the side of the wall after meals, and this was the only chair that was on the table at that time. Also noticed a fruit basket on the table, did not even bother asking my mom when she woke up if a fruit was missing.
TLDR, avoid fairies. They are dangerous. And now, the rant. Please refer to the Monsters book for details. I will use the categories defined on it. What you call a fairy has some overlap with other things, which are actually spirits, according to the book. Magic theory states there are other dimensions, not a good word, but for starters it should suffice, which are called levels. These levels range, so to say, from pure matter to pure spirit. For the purpose of our discussion there are 5 of them: physical, etheric, astral, mental, and spiritual. We exist in all these levels, but our awareness normally is focused on the physical level. You can define this level as physical matter and energy, more or less as understood by modern science. The next level up, a bit less material, a bit more spiritual, is the etheric level. Yes, the word was borrowed from 19th century physics. Our material body exists in the physical level. There is an etheric body as well. This etheric body is what keeps us alive. Death occurs when the etheric body loses its link with the physical body. Normally the etheric body is unconscious when disconnected. In some circumstances it remains awake, forming some kinds of ghosts, and more rarely, what's defined on that book as a vampire. the disconnected etheric body normally decays and dies in about a week. This process is called second death. Now, the fairies. Fairies don't exist in the physical level. They are beings of the etheric level. In their dimension, they look like multicolored balls or ovoids. People normally perceive them through a natural ability they have, of reading our minds and projecting a species of image based on the mind content. Here, what you see is what you believe. And so, the fairies can take many forms: little people, in Asia, shapeshifting white foxes, in America, greys. So far, so good. Like I said, they are dangerous. For two reasons. First one, they have a species of mixture, which if you eat, disconnect your physical body from your etheric body, but avoiding the second death. Which means, you die but stays trapped essentially forever in their dimension. Because of their illusion projection abilities, they can make this look like anything they want. So here is the first rule when dealing with fairies. Never eat their food. Second, it seems there are several types of fairies. Each of them is different from one another, of course. And they will react to different situations in their own, unpredictable ways. The etheric level is very different from ours. The minds of the beings there evolved in ways adapted to their environment, which has its own laws. They are very different from us, which makes impossible to understand their antics. And they have their own, from our viewpoint twisted, sense of humor. They are not beyond practical jokes, and their opinion of what is acceptable is not the same as ours. But in one thing they are similar: they have their own taboos. Break those, and like with humans, you will be in a world of hurt. What to expect? Folklore tells about some of them. Refer to the books above, especially Briggs' Encyclopedia, before even thinking to contact those things, which I can't recommend, because eventually you will offend them, and then consequences will happen.